Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Maxwell here from the Room of Arachnids. And for a while now, honestly since the beginning of this channel, I've always wanted to start a series of guides and videos on how people can identify some of the common spider species they might encounter in North America. So I'm super excited to start this series, and you should all be as well. There's going to be a lot of really fun educational videos coming up. And this is going to be our pilot episode, if you will, where I'm kind of testing out the waters, seeing who likes this content and how it can be improved. So without further ado, let's get right into an overview of the species today, Tigrosa grandis. An overview of Tigrosa grandis taxonomically, a little bit of history, is it was initially discovered by Nathan Banks in 1894. It was put into the genus Geolycosa because of its burrowing behavior. However, we know now this is not accurate. It is not related to any Geolycosa species. However, it took a long time for scientists to realize that, and so it was up until 2009 that it was known as Geolycosa grandis. And then in 2009, it was moved into the genus Hogna grandis by Slowick and Cushing. And then it had a 3-year tenure there, and then it was moved into the newly erected genus Tigrosa and is now known as Tigrosa grandis to this day. So the physical description of it, it's a pretty dark spider. It's also a very large spider. Most often they are pretty dark with a dark reddish brown coloration, with some light banding on the legs and some pretty unique patterns such as chevrons and medial stripes. Their body length usually exceeds 10 millimeters, and their diagonal leg span is typically around 76 millimeters, which is about 3 inches. But it is native to the north central Great Plains of North America. It's very common for most of the central plains. Not necessarily as common as like Hogna carolinensis, but it's still a pretty common spider. So this is the projected range on the right image, and this was from Alan R's research paper on where it was moved into Tigrosa grandis. So as you can see, the states that it was originally supposed to belong to were Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming. And then there's a little bit of an outlier here with Nevada because there aren't any current observations there. And so we don't know if that's necessarily valid, but it possibly could be. But as of right now, it's kind of up in the air whether that is true or not. But the current observations from 2010 to current day are Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, and South Dakota. So let's take a look at some places, some examples of where Tigrosa grandis can be found specifically. So on the top left is a Great Plains or a dry land from Montana. It's from central Montana. As you can see, the humidity is very low here. There's some sandy dirt here, and there's some shrubs, but it's overall very dry of a location. And the one on the right is a little bit more moist, but it's overall still very dry. But this is kind of showing where they can kind of coexist with humans pretty close with them as well. And then the bottom picture just kind of showcases a very similar environment, but a little bit more flat area. So let's go into the identification itself. So we're going to start off with the Tigrosa grandis adult females and their dorsal view, so the bird's eye up and down view of Tigrosa grandis. So overall, these spiders do actually look pretty different. The one on the right is significantly darker and a little bit more stocky than the individual on the left. The one on the left is more splayed out, and it possesses a little bit more of a gray-brown coloration instead of the dark black to brown coloration. Now, this is kind of just what we're going to encounter with species all around the world. It's just natural variation depending on their environment and the localities. Because it has such a big range in the United States, it's bound to look a little bit different in different places. And so the one on the left, these are both adult females. They're both Tigrosa grandis, and they're both found in the Central Plains. Now, the average body length of these individuals are 18.2 to about 23.6 millimeters, which is about 0.7 to 0.9 inches in body length, and that is from the front of the carapace to the end of the abdomen. And the leg span, like I said earlier, is about 76 millimeters, about 3 inches. Now, some of the common things that we can find about these two spiders are the very vibrant yellow medial stripe, which is going right down the center of the carapace, as well as this leg banding. As you can see, this has got some Very nice leg banding on both of the individuals, as well as these chevrons. At the end of the abdomen, you can kind of see these little horizontal patterns, and those are called chevrons. And they're very common on Tigrosa grandis, and that's a pretty good identification factor. All of these put together can help you identify the species. Let's go to the ventral, which is a little bit better of an identifying factor. So as you can see, these are two different species, both in the genus Tigrosa, and they actually do look pretty similar. But I'm going to point out a couple key differences because they are often confused with one another. So the one on the left, as you can see, it's got some pretty sparsely populated speckles on the ventral side of the abdomen, and it's got some, it's overall pretty, greenish brown coloration, pretty standard. But the one on the right is actually Tigrosa aspersa, a closely related species. And as you can see, the ventral of the abdomen is much darker. It's almost fully black. It's very dense with dark speckles, and also the underneath of the legs have these little yellow bands on it, which can differentiate Tigrosa aspersa from Tigrosa grandis ventrally. I did forget to mention this, but when it comes to Tigrosa grandis ventrals, they can have some natural variation, just like the dorsal, but they're going to tend to be a lot more consistent than the dorsal. So if you want someone to identify a spider for you, try to include a dorsal image and a ventral image. This can kind of help narrow down the species because there's so much natural variation throughout every single spider species, and so they can get confused pretty often. But that's what you're usually going to see here is some lightly speckled orange to yellow underside of the abdomen with lightly speckled spots. So now that we've talked about those two, the ventral and the dorsal, let's talk about the frontal. Now the frontal holds the best identification factor. It is the yellow blotches under the eyes. As you can see, under the primary two big eyes, there is two little yellow blotches or cheek marks. Looks like they have yellow blush on. So every single Tigrosa grandis individual will possess these at one point in their life. Adult females you can especially see them because of the dark backdrop that their natural coloration is. A little bit of comparison here, like I talked about earlier. We talked a little bit about Tigrosa aspersa and Tigrosa grandis. As you can see, Tigrosa grandis has those little yellow blotches under the eyes, those little yellow spots, and Tigrosa aspersa does not have that. So that's a very good distinguishing factor in how you can tell the two apart. So now that we've talked about the females, let's talk about the adult males. So we're going to start off with the dorsal the same way. So just like the adult females, they do have a little bit of variation in the coloration. So the one on the right is a little bit more vibrant in yellow, and the one on the left is a little bit more drab, a little bit more plain, and it has like a tan tone to its overall coloration. But I'm going to point out some of the consistencies here with the patternings, because that's really where the key identification comes from, is the patterns. So on the carapace, or the head, there is a yellow medial stripe, just like on the females, and the little starburst pattern that spreads through this black section of the carapace. So you can see that that is consistent on both individuals, both adult males. And going on to the abdomen, there's also some consistency there as well. The little cardiac mark, which is where the heart is located on the anatomy of wolf spiders, there's a consistency there too. The little oval shape with the spikes on the bottom of it, that is the cardiac mark. But you can see that very easily. It's consistent there, they look the same. And the little chevron markings is also similar on both of them. And now the body length of these Tigrosa grandis males are about 18.2 to 22 millimeters, which is about 0.7 to 0.85 inches. And the leg span is about 80 millimeters, which is about 3.15 inches. So now we've covered the dorsal, let's take a look at the ventral. So the ventral of the Tigrosa grandis adult males is a little bit more tricky than the adult females. Now these are both grandis. These are both actually captured in the same exact area, both from Kansas. The one on the left obviously has a little bit more of a plain and a single toned color ventral. There's not a whole lot of speckling, but the one on the right has a lot more detailed and dense amount of speckles, and they're much darker. So this is just some natural variation that we've been talking about again. These are both the same species, both the same sex, both the same age, and yet they have such different ventrals. So now moving on to the frontal, like we talked about earlier, it was the best identifying factor for females, but since the adult male coloration is yellow, just like the blotches, it's much harder to see them. Now, when we see these blotches on the females, their backdrop, their normal coloration is black or a gray, and they have a lot of contrast in these little cheek markings. And that isn't nearly as visible on the adult males. They are still there, but it just blends in with their overall coloration more. So it is a little bit more tricky to identify the adult males solely based on their overall ventral pictures and the frontal pictures. Alright, hey everyone, real quick, I want to make an interjection before we continue on to our next section. I have just covered the adult males and the adult females of Tigrosa grandis, and for about 90% of the encounters that you're going to have with Tigrosa, this is probably enough to identify them pretty easily. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Of course, I'm very willing to answer them, but I'm about to move on to the juveniles of Tigrosa grandis, which is going to be a little bit more in depth and probably a little bit unnecessary for the average viewer. But if you're willing to learn a little bit extra, I'm going to go in depth, and if you're going to click off, thanks for watching, but if you're going to continue watching and you want to learn a little bit more, thanks for sticking around, and I will get right back to the identification. So we're going to go over the Tigrosa grandis juveniles. This is probably be the shortest section here. The Tigrosa grandis juvenile females dorsal coloration. Now this basically looks identical to the Tigrosa grandis females, the adults, but I want to point out something real quick before we move on from this section. The coloration is a little bit different, as you can tell. The individual on the left, exceptionally green. It is very green, and this is a sign of immaturity. In my experience, once the female has the final molt, she will turn a completely solid color instead of having that green tinge. And so that's something for hobbyists, or if you're just trying to identify the age, how old the spider is. If you see a greenish tinge, that means you know it's immature. And so we're just going to move right along to the ventral, which is also a little bit different. As you can see, it does also have that greenish tinge underneath the legs. I have a comparison between the adult and juvenile ventral abdomen markings. And so the one on the right is the adult, of course, and it has a lot darker of a coloration. It's like a caramel orange background with a little bit more dense speckles, but the one on the left is a little bit more pale and also has a little bit less dense with the speckles. The Tigrosa grandis juvenile female frontal is basically the same as the adult females. They have the yellow cheek marks, very easy to identify, and again, they possess that greenish tinge that indicates their immaturity. So now the juvenile male dorsal, we're going to move on to those. And as you can immediately tell, they look different from both the adult females, the juvenile females, and the adult males. They look very different, they're very unique. And they do not possess quite the same green coloration, the green tinge that the juvenile females have. And so that's also a good differentiating factor, is the greenish tinge is not nearly as strong, though you can sometimes see it, but it's not nearly as strong among juvenile males. Coloration itself is going to look like adult males. It's going to be tan, it's going to be a lighter color. But the patterns look very similar to juvenile females, in fact. They look like adult females and juvenile females with their chevron markings, their cardiac mark, and their medial stripe, as well as the banding on the legs looks the same. But one thing you got to point out here is the lighter coloration, the slight green tinge, not nearly as strong on the males as it is on the females. So we'll move right along to the ventral. And this picture on the left is honestly the best Tigrosa grandis juvenile male ventral picture I could get. But it does have a little bit of that green tinge like I was talking about, but look at it's not nearly as strong as that female that we talked about earlier. And the ventral is going to be lightly speckled, just like the female. So the ventral is going to look basically the same as the female. And the adult comparison, again, a little bit more darker coloration and the more intense speckles. And this is one of our last sections here. It is the frontal, and their coloration as a juvenile is a little bit darker than they would be as adults, and so you can more easily see the cheek markings as youngsters, even as males. So even though it's not as strong on the adult males, it is pretty easy to spot on the juvenile males. Alright everybody, that will wrap up our pilot episode for how to identify some common spider species in North America. I don't know if I want it to be that name, because that sounds exhausting to say every episode. So if you have any recommendations on what we should officially call this series, just leave it down below in the comments. And so that will be all from me today. A little bit longer of an upload. I'm sure you'll be missing that. I haven't posted in a year. So, enjoy this long upload. I got more in the works right now with Hogna carolinensis. I think I'm going to focus on Tigrosa first, but I've already worked on a little bit of the Hogna carolinensis one. But yeah, I expect like Tigrosa aspersa or Georgical or something like that next. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I will catch you guys later.